Okay. Greetings, everyone. Greetings to friends of the Center for Reparation Research, members of our advisory board, the network of scholars, colleagues of the UWI. Good morning. And welcome to this in the series of webinars focused on the CARICOM Reparation 10-point plan. First, let me acknowledge that the UWI Mona campus recognizes and declares that the land on which we operate as an institution of higher learning is the original or traditional territory of many peoples. The UWI acknowledges the First Nation comprising the indigenous people who were displaced by the Columbus Project and general European colonization, and the hundreds of Africans who toiled for more than 100 years as enslaved people on the old Papine sugar estate. The UWI recognizes their labor and sacrifices in preserving this land that has enabled the establishment of a university that now provides opportunities for many of their descendants to receive an education that they themselves were, in fact, denied. The CARICOM Reparation Commission's 10-point plan of 2013 has offered the Caribbean a blueprint for development based on analysis of the lasting legacies of chattel slavery in the region. This development plan provides details on various areas of repair necessary to achieve stability in the region beyond the challenges of the past, specifically within the boundaries of our post-colonial plantation societies. And the Center for Reparation Research has a mandate involving education, advocacy, and research. So it is its work to create a space for interdisciplinary discussion about the whys and the hows for achieving fundamental development goals. Now, we have been focused on these webinars, and I suppose you just heard me say that part of our mandate is education. So with a mandate to educate, the webinar series focused on CARICOM's 10-point plan has, in a sense, always touched on education. But today, we take a dedicated look at education, and in particular, decolonizing education. And I want us to think about this fundamental question throughout this webinar. What does the Caribbean citizen look like in 2035? And is it our education systems that would deliver on the vision of what the Caribbean citizen must look like in 2025? And when I say look like, I don't mean aesthetically. I mean, what is the capacity of that Caribbean citizen? How does that Caribbean citizen function vis-a-vis other citizens in the world? How does the Caribbean citizen position themselves for development in the region, for manifesting the development that the region requires? So today, we focus on education and whether we consider the legacy of the colonial enterprise that brought Caribbean islands schools aligned to churches, or the lack of investment in education, class being a determinant to access education, devaluation of indigenous ways of knowing, even teaching of Marcus Garvey's philosophies and opinions in schools, the lack of health and family life education. There are so many angles that we can pursue in this context of decolonizing education. And of course, we have a capable panel of experts to examine this subject, particularly strategies, challenges, new Caribbean futures from various angles. And so I'll now introduce our panelists in the order that they will appear. Let me begin with Dr. Moji Anderson, who is an anthropologist, qualitative health researcher, and senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. She conducts research and publishes in the areas of health, sexualities, and identities in Jamaica and the Caribbean diaspora. She is co-founder of Beyond Homophobia, the biennial UWI conference, and co-editor with Dr. Erin McLeod of Beyond Homophobia, Centering LGBTQ Experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean. Cynthia Malone is an ecologist, artist, and abolitionist of Afro-Guyanese descent. She has researched wildlife ecologies, primatology, and ecosystem stewardship alongside Black and Indigenous peoples globally for over 15 years. Cynthia completed her BSc in zoology and anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she researched the nesting ecology of orangutans in Indonesia for her undergraduate honors thesis. For her master's in conservation biology at Columbia University, she explored shifting relationships between farmers and wildlife surrounding plantation geographies in Cameroon. I am totally enamored with the work that Cynthia is doing, and I've been pleased to meet her personally only over the last month. Her current research, art, and spiritual praxis unfolds throughout the Caribbean and South America while tracing her ancestral lineage in Guyana. Dr. David Alston is no stranger to us. David is an independent historian based in the Highlands of Scotland. For over 25 years, he has researched the role of Highland Scots in the plantations of the Caribbean, especially Guyana, and the lives of the Africans they enslaved. His Slaves and Highlanders, Silence Histories of Scotland and the Caribbean, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2021, was a Saltire Society Scottish Book of the Year 2022. His most recent publication is The Guyana Maroons, 1796 to 1834, Persistent and Resilient Until the End of Slavery, in Slavery and Abolition 2023. David has also been campaigning for the return to Jamaica of the funds held by the Dick Bequest Trust, an educational charity established by James Dick, a merchant and slave trader in Kingston. And of course, David, we're going to talk to you so much more about your reparation work. Dr. Dion Edwards-Carr, last but not least, holds a PhD in Educational Studies from University of Manchester, MSc in Educational Research from University of Manchester as well. She was awarded the first Carriacou Education Trust Graduate Fellowship in the UK. She has conducted postdoctoral research for the prestigious Joseph Rowntree Trust. And of course, she holds also MSc in Economics, BSc Economics and Management from the UWI Mona campus. She also has a diploma in teacher education. She is our resident teacher education specialist on this panel, and currently a senior lecturer in research and assessment in the School of Education, and of course, Dean Designate, appointed Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, a new post she will hold as of August 1. She has received a number of Principals Research Awards at the University of the West Indies, Mona, and her research work spans the Caribbean. To date, she has written some 17 technical reports aimed at reforming the education system in the Caribbean, including regional and national policies and strategy for special education, something we haven't even begun to touch on in the context of our reparatory justice work. Special education is particularly important to me, and I would also add not just special education, but when we talk about education as a one-size-fits-all term, we are never also speaking about those who are in need of the education, the kind of education that would give them, genius, the challenge that they need for genius level education. So let me now ask each of our panelists, in the order that they were introduced, to give us their remarks, 7-10 minutes or so. And we will start, of course, with Dr. Anderson. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Sonia for inviting me to this webinar, I should say. I'm going to talk about the need for epistemological repair, which means more or less fixing biases around knowledge in the education system. I don't have to tell anybody this, but I'm saying it anyway. Reparation is a liberation project, a project of emancipation from white supremacy. And one of the places where white supremacy does the most damage is the education system, which tells us the knowledge that society considers to be valid. So right now, I'm going to point out some challenges to decolonizing education by focusing on high school textbooks. And then I'll talk briefly about decolonizing strategies. Firstly, I chose textbooks because, as other researchers have put it, the textbook is perhaps the most effective subagent for inducting the young into the culture of their society. And of course, I'm not the first to do this kind of research. Previous studies have found both improvement over the years and racist bias, and that our regional education system is, to quote one researcher, inherently exclusionary. What I did was look at 20 secondary level Caribbean history, Caribbean studies, social studies, religious education, and sociology textbooks, most of which were written by Black, Jamaican, or Caribbean people. And I concluded that over half of them show that education needs repair. So here are some examples. Some textbooks echo racist theories and perspectives. So for example, one calls hunter-gatherer indigenous groups that use stone tools primitive. A sociology textbook calls Haitian Vodou, the Haitian religion Vodou, a cult, even though the textbook's definition of cult doesn't completely fit Vodou or other Afro-Christian belief systems. And also that definition includes other problematic language. So for example, it says that a cult has few coherent doctrines and may make use of black magic. There are some other books, two books that make unsubstantiated references to so-called ancestor worship when describing African belief systems. Another describes the Kalinago as animal-like, saying the Kalinagos, being warlike, might have migrated in search of new prey. Another book supports the claim that Columbus discovered this region because it says, discovery is about getting to a place and of establishing access to it. But the authors of the book had also said that indigenous people had crossed over from Asia along the Bering Strait. So the book's own logic means that it was possible that indigenous people did discover the Americas because they did get to a place from Asia. I notice also that patois is only used in a few textbooks and not in the main text. It's usually reserved for comic strips illustrating a point made in the text or suggesting an activity for the students. I also noticed that non-European trained and non-European inspired artists were described as if they were illegitimate in one book. So one says, they paint in a way that is alien to traditional manner. So you can only really understand traditional here as meaning European norms. But actually, in a lot of cases, what we see is a textbook writer swinging between critical and white supremacist perspectives. So one text points out that your ethnicity can result in different interpretations of history, so that a Caribbean historian's account of slavery would inevitably be critical of it. Later, however, it sets up an activity where students, quote, formulate a set of slave laws that could be deemed fair, end quote, as if slave laws could ever be fair. And it says that, quote, the initial attacks on the system of slavery originated in Britain, as those in the British West Indies were unable to help themselves. And it dates the earliest abolitionist movement's accomplishments to 1772, which I think everybody knows in this webinar was over a decade after the Tacky Revolt and Coromantee War. While another book does have sections like the genocide of the Taino and ways in which the Taino were killed, the authors of the book also defend Columbus, saying his behavior was typical of Christians at the time. This is a problem for probably more than a couple of reasons. It suggests that the opinions of non-Christians were irrelevant. And the next page of the book shows that not all Christians are like that when it discusses Columbus's Christian contemporaries, including a monk who condemned his and others' treatment of indigenous people. In addition, Europeans and their institutions are sometimes given the benefit of the doubt without supporting evidence. So for example, that same textbook says that Columbus, quote, wanted to treat the Taino fairly, and that the conquistadores were motivated by, quote, an adventurous spirit. So to sum up, while the books show that Caribbean people have been and still are subjected to injustice, some also say that these injustices were committed by ultimately well-meaning, naive, sometimes unfairly criticized foreigners. Some also argue implicitly that the yardsticks imposed by those foreigners are valid for understanding and judging Caribbean peoples and their ancestors. This simultaneous marginalization and inclusion means that African-derived cultural practices are presented, but in such a way that suggests they're not fully accepted by the authors, using othering language to describe artistic productions and sidelining patois send a message that practices outside of Euro-American norms are suspect. And some things they say are just plain wrong. African scholars have long said that Africans don't worship their ancestors, they respect and give offerings to them, but they worship their gods and their spirits. Another researcher of Jamaican textbooks rightly warned that, quote, culturally ingrained histories and perspectives present themselves as neutral facts and become official accounts. So I wonder about the effect of interspersing subjective perspectives among factual details. This could make their presence less obvious and therefore more easily digested. So as students learn about Columbus's landing in 1494 and the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria, they are also learning about his desire to do good. As students learn about different slave society regimes, they also learn that it is possible for slave laws to be fair. Students might not be able to identify the difference between facts and the fiction hidden among these facts. As I close, I quote Frantz Fanon in honor of his 100th birthday last Sunday, July 20th. What matters is not to know the world, but to change it. So we need transformational pedagogy to decolonize education. Strategies could include a counter curriculum in which teachers address the multifaceted manifestations of white supremacy, with textbooks supporting the cause so that students use their imagination and critical thinking to name and fight injustice. There's also meta-curriculum or meta-learning pedagogy, in which students are encouraged to think through the reasoning and machinations behind the material in their textbooks. Counter storytelling in texts and by students themselves will help challenge the silences by making our stories the center. Our stories are important not just for the narratives, but for the epistemological and ontological framework and sense of community that storytelling establishes and reinforces. The reparations movement has rightly recognized that any project of repair must spend a great deal of energy at the epistemological level. This is the foundation for understanding all that is taught, why and how, and providing ideas of how to move forward free of chains, psychological, economic, political, cultural, and so on. So I want to think that my research and the research I'm going to do on primary school textbooks can inform the reparatory work to fix the epistemological damage created by white supremacy and pave the way for an emancipated new Caribbean future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. I think we've started off on the right note. In fact, you've told us that the Caribbean citizen of 2035 is in jeopardy based on the research that you're doing. An indictment, I would say, on educators, policymakers, so many of us who are not necessarily even cognizant of the ways in which white supremacy and white supremacist ideologies are still so present in the ways in which we are, in fact, creating textbooks, because these textbooks were not created by other people now. We have been independent countries, but we have not sought to assess where it is we are at in terms of moving our societies and our citizens forward. This textbook research, I would want to say, is very, very critical. I am myself I wouldn't say shocked, but I am saddened that this is still where we're at in 2025. I would want to say you are completely correct and on point. Transformational pedagogy to fight injustice. In fact, the critical thinking to be able to discern this kind of challenge in our education system is even more critical. And of course, we know the challenges we have had with even putting critical thinking as part of our curriculum in the subjects that we are exposing our students to. But also, I would say the concerted effort now in terms of our reparatory justice movement to rewrite the wrongs of the past has got to be the job of every single educator, of every single citizen, in whatever way, shape, or form we can occupy that work. Let me ask Cynthia Malone now to give us her remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia. My mind is already percolating with so many ideas after hearing Dr. Anderson speak. Truly, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the center. Thank you to everyone here today. Thank you to my ancestors. Thank you to all the vital forces that have collaborated in bringing us all together today in this really critical work. I do have some slides to share. Hopefully, technology will cooperate in this. Give me a second. Can you all see the slides? Okay, great.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work as a scientist engaged in decoloniality, and thinking through specifically what a liberatory science education might look like through epistemic justice and repair. In thinking about decolonizing education systems and knowledge, in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is memory. And I really love and feel deeply about this poem from Lucille Clifton, who is a legendary Black American poet. And she wrote this poem, "Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine." And so this memory work is really critical as we think, beyond some of the ways that colonial education has facilitated colonial consciousness and loss of memory. I think it's important to preface a little bit with some of my journey. So I grew up in the diaspora in New York, in Brooklyn and Little Guyana, Richmond Hill, Queens, and was very determined from a young age to become a scientist, even though I didn't have many examples around me in terms of formal education in this path. But I made my way. I studied orangutans in Indonesia, did my master's work in Cameroon. Eventually, more recently, 2017, made my way to Guyana, where I've been researching plantation geographies alongside wildlife, especially howler monkeys. And through this work in the sciences as a Black woman, navigated not only racism individually, but some of the ways that science, natural sciences in particular, and the ways in which we're educated really help to solidify the foundations of race, racism, and white supremacy. And so, sorry, some of these slides were altered a bit in the, I think, becoming a PDF. But in thinking about the history of science, a really critical thinker in untying some of that history is incredible Jamaican philosopher, playwright Sylvia Wynter. And she wrote, "The idea of race would come to be the most efficient instrument of social domination invented in the last 500 years. And the invention of this was really grounded through the natural sciences." And so without having the time to fully go through the history of eugenics, it was truly intertwined with the history of the natural sciences. So here's a text called Types of Mankind by an ethnologist, Josiah Knott. And this diagram of human evolution and differences in humans depicted as, this hierarchy of white and Caucasian as being the ideal representation of humanity, and everyone else kind of moving down this line of dehumanization and animalization, specifically comparing Black peoples to monkeys and apes. And as someone who has always been fascinated by wildlife, this boundary and border has been really critical to my work. And I've seen through my own life and living how this process has created a rupture in our systems of relations. And Sylvia Wynter wrote it best when she wrote, the argument of her text proposes that the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethno-class, i.e. Western bourgeoisie, conception of the man, of the human man, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, and that of securing the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of the human species itself, ourselves. So how do we know ourselves as beings on this earth beyond what, racist science might have had us believe? And I think we are still in this project of decolonizing science and science education to rethink who we are and who we can be. So I've led some of this work as an organizer at the American Museum of Natural History, where I worked for many years. I led a protest in collaboration with Decolonize This Place, and we went through the halls, the natural history halls that had these really racist depictions of African peoples. There are also human remains at the Natural History Museum. They also enslaved a human being, Otabenga. They still have memorializations to eugenicists at the museum. And yeah, we led hundreds of people on the floor of the museum and also had a political education project to really think through the ways in which we kind of take for granted how depictions of the natural world are often, embedded in racist ideology. And so this was kind of me in practice, and faced a lot of pushback for that at the time. But thankfully now things are shifting in terms of recognition of these histories. So when we think about what education could be, I think a lot about Bell Hook's work, which she talks about in Teaching to Transgress, education as a practice of freedom. And as an ecologist, I really believe this is fundamentally an ecological process that will require us to reconstitute our relations with all beings. So decolonizing not only our epistemologies, but our consciousness of who we are. Edouard Glissant helps us think about this in his beautiful poetic way. Thinking thought usually amounts to withdrawing into a dimensionless place in which the idea of thought alone persists, but thought in reality spaces itself out into the world. It informs the imaginary of peoples, their varied poetics, which it then transforms, meaning in them, its risk becomes realized. And there's so many examples across Caribbean history where we have lived this truth of enacting our epistemologies and our ecologies towards transformation and revolution. This is a flyer from a class I just finished, a global class called Black Ecologies at the End of the World, where we really dealt with the ways in which our scientific education is inherently colonial and the ways in which we can find agency in reshaping our ways of knowing ourselves. And so just to conclude with some kind of thinking thoughts to move forward with, if we are to decolonize education, we really have to contend with the rupture of Black and Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and relating. Our knowledge systems, including scientific knowledge, are often rendered illegitimate at all levels of formal education. Epistemic repair and justice are necessary. In this process, we must recover our ancient scientific cosmological practices while building a bridge towards surviving present and future ecostemic collapse and transformation. In this process, intergenerational knowledge building is going to be really critical in the knowledge that we gain and sustain from our elders and the knowledge that we gain and sustain from our youth. In the context of Afro-Caribbean peoples, we really already navigate a multiplicity of epistemologies, even within, African spiritual traditional practices. How can our education systems acknowledge and strengthen our existing capacities to do this? What does an education system look like that fosters world building and multi-world navigation, where we have a plurality of epistemologies that are acknowledged? How can scientific institutions complicit in the makings of colonial science give substantive reparation that builds and sustains Black and Indigenous educational systems? So thinking about point 6 of the CARICOM report, but specifically thinking about, scientific institutions. And finally, in thinking about reparations, we can't forget that our liberation does not stop at acknowledging harm, advancing contestation, or making demands of colonial systems. I think as Caribbean peoples, part of the necessary work is coming together to think about what are our visions for real freedom right now, and how can we prepare ourselves to be well and wise ancestors through and with Earth. Thank you all so much. I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and from you all.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I think this struggle you rightly positioned has very much to do with the conception of the human. And Winter, of course, puts us in good stead for understanding this new humanism. But what has racist science had to do with all of this? And I liked your presentation coming from the natural world that you were fascinated with and in fact engaged with. What has racist science had us believing about ourselves is one question. And you, of course, center the fact that decolonizing the natural sciences, decolonizing education around the natural world, these are all also critical. Indeed, the critical thinking work we must do is one to dismantle racist structures of education and ways of knowing. And I'd say in particular, the indigenous and Black ways of knowing, which have suffered particular forms of rupture, as you've rightly positioned. So thinking of the new world that the Columbus Project tried to inaugurate, the so-called new world, we must think of new world building and do that through, fundamentally, I would say, this kind of education project. So I want to move now to our third speaker, so that we have Dr. David Alston. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Can I begin by saying that I feel privileged to have been asked to take part in this webinar. I hope I can do justice to your invitation. I'm an independent historian. I'm not associated with any institution. I'm based in the north of Scotland, and to some extent very much work on my own, and have been doing this research for over 25 years now. And it began very much as my research about my community and trying to understand the lives of so many people who were complicit in the exploitation of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. During that 25 years, my thought has moved on a lot, and over time, I became aware of just how much there was to be recovered in the archives that I looked at about the lives of individual enslaved Africans, their families and their communities, the new communities that they were creating in slavery. Now, my particular interest has always been in Guyana, because through accidents of history, there's a particularly strong connection between those who were engaged in exploitation, those from my part of the world, and Guyana. But in the archives, which I can look at, and I can look at them because I'm in the UK, there is so much of individual lives. And part of the process of reparation, of repair, seems to me must be about making these primary sources for education readily available and freely available. These are things like the registers of slaves, which are held in the National Archives in Kew in London, which begin in 1817 across all of what were British colonies. But by working carefully with these, it's possible to reconstruct something of individual lives, something of family life, something of communities in enslavement. But and there's also very many individual records in public archives and in private archives. But if you ask us what should things be like in 2035, I mean, one of the things I would hope is that this material is much more widely available for people in the Caribbean to explore this history and make that part of the stories that are being told in an education system. Because I believe stories are powerful, and if we can recover stories of individuals, I think we can lead people into a much fuller understanding of what was happening. I think there is, as it happens, I think a very good model in Guyana, where in the cooperation that's taken place between the National Archives of Guyana and the National Archives of the Netherlands, where everything in their archives up to 1815, which is the point at which the colonies were formally ceded to Britain. Everything up till that point has been conserved, digitized, and made freely available. And it was that work available online, and it was that which enabled me to do my most recent piece of published research on the Guyana Maroons. It would have been impossible without that material. There is nothing equivalent in the vast archives that are held in Britain. So that in a way is my first reflection. There needs to be a repair of the access to the primary source material, so that this project can be led from within the Caribbean rather than by privileged people like me who have access to the material because we're in the UK. That's the first reflection. The second reflection I'd like to share arises out of the attempts I've been making with some colleagues over the last 3 years to have the money held by a particular education trust in Scotland returned to Jamaica. This is something called the Dick Bequest. And James Dick was a merchant and slave trader in Kingston in the 1770s. He was a partner with Robert Milliken, who's much better known. Milliken's statue used to stand outside in Docklands in London, outside the Museum of London. And it was removed, quite rightly, as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests. James Dick was his partner. James Dick lived much longer, and when he died, he gave a very substantial amount of money to set up an educational trust, which benefited schools in the northeast of Scotland. The value of that trust, it's still going. The value of the trust is about £1.8 million. But if you think of what's being spent from that trust over the 170 odd years since its foundation, and if you think about the difference that it would have made if it had been used in Jamaica rather than the northeast of Scotland, I think you get some sort of sense of the repair that is needed. What I've learned from this has been the reluctance of people to engage in discussions about reparations. We haven't succeeded in having the money returned. The trustees have very much dug themselves in and are defending their position. But it has made me realize that part of the reason why we have made little progress has been because of the lack of leadership within Scotland at Scottish level, particularly from Scottish government. And I've come to think that it is important that the reparations movement needs to make demands. These are demands that should not only be being made to the UK government, but to devolved administrations within the UK, to the nations of the UK. So that's to the Scottish Parliament, to the Welsh Assembly, to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Because I think that's part of gaining. I think there is a possibility there of gaining some traction. And my model here is something that Desmond Tutu said when he was reflecting on the anti-apartheid campaign and its initial lack of success because the UK government didn't want to engage. And he talked about how important it was at that point to get the engagement of local government within the UK, because that began to make points of contact where things were happening. And over time, I think that began to have an influence on the UK government as a whole. And I think the same is true of the reparations movement. I think it's important that contact is made and demands are made of the devolved administrations and also of local government within the UK. And I think that these demands that should be made, I think, should be related to education, and this is happening to some extent. The University of Glasgow has made commitments to be involved as part of that process of reparation, but I think far more could be done. And I think if CARICOM was perhaps more formally to make approaches to the devolved administrations, this might have benefits. So these are my two reflections, that the data, the information that's held in the archives needs to be liberated. It needs to be made accessible. And these projects of repair, looking at it from the UK's point of view, need to be things that are happening not just at central government level, but down into devolved administrations, to local government, and I think also into communities, forming links there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think those were very, very useful contributions. I myself forgot the kind of strategy used by Desmond Tutu and the ways in which that could inform the CARICOM reparation movement. Very much we appreciate the work you've been doing over the 25 years on the lives of individuals in enslaved communities. You've provided us with a fabulous example of the archives available to Guyanese citizens in particular. And your emphasis here on repairing access to primary source material is very much something we are thinking about in the context of the reparatory justice movement in the Caribbean. We are clear that it is absolutely unjust for people in this region to not have source materials about themselves, about their communities, about their ways of living. And it is no longer palatable for those archives to remain in countries that have been exploitative in their relationship with former colonies. So let me say to you, thank you for reminding us about this strategy. Thank you for positioning it in the context of the reparatory justice work that we must do in the Caribbean, and that the access to archives as something foregrounded in your presentation is one that we have not taken our eyes off of it. And you're correct. The University of Glasgow model, yes, there are definitely other examples we must foster in order to have this repair on a broader scale. So let's hear now from Dr. Dion Edwards-Carr for her contributions. And then remember, please post your questions or comments, continue to post your questions and comments in the chat. We will look at those and be able to pose them to our presenters. And if at all time allows, we are aiming to be here for about 1 hour and 15 minutes. We will have discussion on them. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I must say I'm really happy to hear from David on that matter of the trust. Certainly, that is something we need to look at. Now, today I have taken a very educational approach to this, based on the work that I've been doing in the region across several Commonwealth Caribbean countries over the last 10, 12 years of work. And so this presentation really pulls together quite a bit of that information around evaluating curriculum and evaluating assessment practices and what that looks like and the outcomes inside our Caribbean system. So over the last 5 years, indigenization and how do we indigenize our education systems? How do we indigenize assessment? How do we make it authentic to the experiences of Caribbean peoples? And so the whole point of the presentation is to examine the colonial presence and intent, which actually remains at the heart of national curricula and assessment across Caribbean education systems and continues to be that character of education, continues to be a constraining factor in transforming systems. These are some of the questions that I've been working with in terms of trying to unpick and to interrogate what underpins the curricula, what underpins assessment, national assessment programs, and assessment strategies. Now, from the perspective of an educator, the curriculum really is what we refer to as official knowledge, what can be taught and what cannot be taught. And so following Apple, we speak to the fact that school curriculum is inherently ideological and political because it comes out of the nation state. It is a part of the nation, and therefore it will reflect the social and political and ideological underpinnings of the society. And therefore, the school curriculum is a key site of scrutiny. It's a key site of scrutiny to understand what is happening in the education system. The high stakes, large scale standardized tests that we know of in the region from primary to secondary school have been key policy tools in education systems and is actually the basis for the meritocratic placement system that we continue to use. Now, in terms of trying to figure this out and to put it all together, I have worked with critical pedagogy meeting post-colonial analysis, which for me gives me, I don't know how many people are mathematicians in here, but for me, it is equal to Nettleford's indigenization. That's my math, right? So don't want to take too long, but just to give you an idea, and as I've said before, critical pedagogy allows us to interrogate those social and political frameworks that are embedded in the curriculum content and strategies, and that invariably reinforce what happens in the society. Similarly, post-colonial theory foregrounds that unequal power distribution between the colonial subject. And a big part of that is what are the consequences for creating a hierarchical society. Importantly, from an assessment perspective, in educational measurement, we speak of the consequences of assessment for students. And if those consequences impact the life chances of students, then invariably the outcomes for education are likely to be skewed. And so the focus of the analysis is the distribution of power within the curriculum and assessment policies and how that frames what happens in schools. So as I said, this particular presentation brings together a combination of curriculum evaluation and review research. I'm not just speaking off the top of my head. This is work that we've been doing for several years in terms of trying to figure out what's the structure, what are the contexts, what are the inputs, what are the processes, what are the outcomes from the curriculum, in addition to literature review, that helps us to understand what's being done, what research is being done, and what is that research saying about how the system is actually working. And so the focus in those reviews have been on those empirical and conceptual papers that focus a lot on structural inequality. So what has been the path to educational reform in Caribbean countries? We have more than 50 years of attempting to transform education through, I might say, quite a bit of bilateral and multilateral grant and loan funding to reform education. And this is where Michael's point is extremely important. So we've had the World Bank, we have had the now defunct, we've had the USAID, which is now defunct, we have had IADB, CEDA, DFID, and many, many more. In fact, it's to the point where these agencies and the projects they offer are actually line items in the education budgets of most Caribbean countries, right? Because these IDPs are very important, critical players in the development of educational program. What we've had, though, is a projectization of educational reform in the region. And so it's been mostly fragmented. And so when something trends, for example, something about boys' education or early childhood education, it is trending. Once the fund is finished, it fades away, and there's limited opportunity to shift what is happening structurally. So generally, the path has been access, equity, and quality to produce transformation. And I keep asking the question, for whom? So just to give you an idea in terms of curriculum and assessment framework in the Caribbean, at the primary level, we tend to, in terms of curriculum, we tend to have a formal or explicit national curriculum, so primary is K to 6. In Jamaica, we have the NSC. In the on the OECS, we have the OECS curriculum framework. It is now under review. At the lower secondary school level, there's usually, it's very loose at this point between grade 7 to 9. We find that there isn't really a formal explicit curriculum. Jamaica, however, has made a difference by introducing the NSC up to grade 9, and that is good. What I've seen a lot of schools, school systems try to do is actually implement the CCSLC from CXC between grade 7 and 9. That has worked in some way, and that might be something we need to look at. And then at the upper secondary school system, now this is very, very rigid. The Caribbean Examinations Council syllabi from grade 10 to 13 is what is clearly in place. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So what are some of the observations in terms of what's happening with the curriculum and assessment? Actual strategies in the classroom, regardless of the philosophy of the curriculum, whether it's constructivism, what we've found is strict ability grouping based on levels of competence, gender-based groupings, whole class approach to teaching, which is heavily didactic. So it's straight up chalk and talk, individual seat work, whiteboard, blackboard, which is the center of the classroom. The teacher is the center, and the emphasis is on attainment targets that are written into the curriculum for mastery learning. What are the key consequences coming out of that for our children? Robust streaming right across the school system and in all the Caribbean countries that I've been in. A significant number of students attend extra lessons. Exclusion of children, in some cases, from sitting tests at grade 4 and 6. And at the end of primary school, the differentiation in secondary school placement. At the secondary level, again, we see the same thing. Seat work, gender-based groupings. What are the actual outcomes again? Heavy focus on the external exams. Extra lessons is big business. By last count, I understood it to be about 15 billion just in Jamaica alone, right? One of the things we see is the patterns that set schools apart. So the outcomes for children are that they are actually streamed into particular schools based on this meritocratic placement system that says, if you are 90%, then you go to this school, which is an elite school. And if you are 40%, then you go to this school, which is think school. So there's quite, once you get to the end of secondary school, there's quite a bit of exclusion from sitting CSEC. And we've seen that a lot of that, particularly with the STEM subjects, that's the chemistry, the physics, the biology, where just about 14% of the cohort of grade 11s tend to sit those subjects. You will find more done with math and English, but for the most part, the subject areas that can help students to begin to form themselves as part of an occupational field tend to be highly selective. So 3 general views of the school system. The academic subjects as the focal point is subject-based, heavy assessment, 6 weeks, end of year, end of term. And 2, another form is the academic and vocational subjects offered. They're both compulsory and electives, but there's limited application to the real world. And 3, attempts to integrate the academic and the vocational subjects with employability skills embedded in teaching and learning. And what we find most is that it's the view number 1 that predominates in the system. What are some of the actual outcomes for children? What we do find is at grades 10 and 11, and for people from other parts of the Caribbean, Form 4 and 5, high repetition and dropout rates, particularly among boys. The exclusion from the national exams and from the external exams really affect the overall pass rate, right? And so the streaming, the stratification that we see actually places students in a box, right? Just get this here. So in terms of the national and external examinations as the benchmark, year after year, we're seeing less and less students eligible, as in they're not ready to sit an exam at grade 11. The overall exclusion from, and that we see within the system, means that Caribbean countries have not yet reckoned with this idea of inclusion and what it means. So in truth and in fact, notwithstanding the waves of reform that we've seen, the philosophy and the purpose of the education systems in the Caribbean have in fact maintained the colonial character and the present. The outcomes tell us that at the expense of indigenizing, right? So how does the theory help us? And I just want to deal with this very quickly. What we found is that the analytical approach underpinned by critical pedagogy and post-colonial theory highlighted 5 common issues. These show that much of the efforts towards reforming or transforming national curricula, in fact, sought to update. So rather than reform or dismantle, it sought to update the colonial meritocratic structure rather than uproot it and replace it with an indigenous system of education that reflects the economic issues, the social relations, the political movements, and the cultural expressions of Caribbean societies. The goals of the curricula in the region have largely been framed by international development goals. So more recently, the MDGs and the SDGs, these along with goals of international funding agencies have eclipsed local ideas. This has led to projectization and piecemeal reform of the education sector in all countries. Projectization often does not account for local needs or recognize the expertise developed by local teachers. Instead, focuses is on 2 main strategies: best practices and training of trainers. And I can tell you that Caribbean teachers hate the idea of training of trainers. Both approaches are ways that have undermined what is suitable for the context and the particular issues that Caribbean people face. Practices were seen and experienced by educators as an imposition, limiting opportunities to try out approaches that fit the needs of students and contexts in which they live and grow. Similarly, the training of the trainer approach was eschewed by most teachers because they saw it as a way to maintain the hierarchical structure which already undermined their professional practice. Another point, teaching and learning across the school system are geared towards the syllabi of external examiners, and these, of course, are the vestiges of colonial education. This creates limited options for students and are heavily academic. Although the current examinational body is regional, the approach of using these exams as the only marker for success narrows the definition of outcomes that are actually possible. 3, rigorous and systematic academic streaming, both at the school, class, and individual level, means differentiated quality of teaching and learning. In many countries, the weak or underperforming students were allowed to continue the system for 5 years of secondary school or drop out with little attempt to address their needs, and they are routinely placed in remedial classes where they're not really required to sit any exams. And an important marker of the system, those who can pay. Extra lessons is a huge industry, both in countries, in all the countries. Parents spend millions of dollars to ensure that the children are able to meet the content requirement of the high stakes external exams. The perception that what happens in the classroom is insufficient to give students an advantage is validated by the performance to access extra lessons. And an important point which came up across the region, because the Caribbean is Creole in many ways, and Creole speaking, Patois speaking people, there is this loyalty by the school system to English language as the first language, and which overshadows the Creole language of Caribbean peoples. Language is used in the main era of post-colonial hybridity and is an area of contestation and resistance within classrooms. The daily interactions in schools with teachers restrict the use of Creole, which was mainly accepted only in cultural performances, drama, poetry, and in other words, it has a place, but outside of the mainstream. It is the other and was the inadvertent designator of the Creole-speaking student. So what we do find is asking the question, what then would indigenization look like? My first point is that the education system has not really developed on creating a path for national development. We can't pursue transforming or decolonizing education without dismantling the idea that school starts with a primer class, followed by 6 standards and an examination to access secondary school. Indigenization would mean starting with the question of what kind of society we want to live in, and then considering how we have evolved and what are our ways of knowing. What is the Caribbean epistemology? What is the St. Lucian epistemology? The people of the Caribbean, according to Nettleford, and which is the reason why I have clung to this idea, have in fact transformed liabilities into assets. So decolonization is very possible, and have long eked out of suffering and severance modalities of survival through the exercise of the creative intellect and the creative imagination collectively and individually. So in truth and in fact, where do we need to go? Where do we need to go? The creative intellect, harnessing the creative intellect of Caribbean people, making that the focal point for teaching and learning, and not just through artistic expressions. The oral features of Caribbean identity and culture should take precedence in pedagogy. And the inclusion for diversity, given our diversity, ethnicity, languages, inclusion is not a byword or a marginalized other, but a constituent part of how we think about and practice schooling. And very important, all Jamaicans, I guess, would understand what I mean by yard knowledge and experience coming out of the home, accounting for constructs in the curriculum rather than denying that there is a nation space that exists in the school, the children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dion. There is something that has definitely produced this kind of revolutionary spirit in some of us. And that's a personal comment to you now. I really want to thank you for very much positioning the fact that a colonial education system is not going to be where we're going to produce decolonized education. No. That, in fact, when we go all the way back to our cultural thinkers, they have been clear that the work we must do is broad-based and must involve the creative imagination. You know, the Caribbean has, as far as I know, but you know, anybody here can correct me, I don't know of a performing arts secondary school. And for a region that has produced so much creativity, in fact, the World Bank has identified countries like Jamaica as having some of the highest creativity quotients. You wonder to yourself why it is that we have ourselves devalued the kind of creativity that oozes out of this region. So this matter of indigenizing education, indigenizing assessment, indigenizing curriculum is deep, much deeper than many of us are thinking about on a daily basis. And Dion has positioned for us the kind of systemic issues that we ordinary citizens are not considering. The language question came up before in Moji's presentation, but it has been centered, I think, in a most appropriate way within Dion's conversation. Because then what we see, and many of us have been talking about this in the public domain, that the loyalty to the colonial language, particularly English, is part of what is maintaining this elitist education that excludes many who enter the school system with Creole as their first language. And it is not for lack of publicizing, not for lack of trying to get into questions around policy, language policy, and so on. It's not for lack of research on the part of scholars within the University of the West Indies, for example. It is absolutely a lack of political will. So I see questions in the chat being raised about, okay, so if we know the answers to these questions and we know that the colonial education system is a problem, and we have been the decolonial ones in the region now, certainly since independence, why haven't we fixed the problem? And I'm suggesting that the problem is far more complex than we imagine. So let me open up now. I mean, I've said a few things. I've been, rejoining with comments after presentations, and also infusing some of my own questions, certainly the one focused on the Caribbean citizen of 2035. What does that citizen look like? What is the capacity of that citizen? What are the things we must be focused on now to understand that citizen? So let me ask our panelists, or even those persons within the conversation online, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, now is your time to raise them.
Well, I do for Cynthia. I would love to know.
Absolutely.
Hi, thanks a lot, everyone. Everything was fascinating to me. And I think that Dion's work is sort of like the framework for my work. She talks about the structure and I'm talking about the content. So I think our work looks very good together. And I did some reading for my paper of your work, Dion. So thank you. Cynthia, I was hoping to get a sense of what specific things you do to try to decolonize science, specific activities or strategies that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Moji. Yeah, I mean, there's so much, I think a lot from the work of Dr. Leon Simpson, who is, or she's not a doctor, but she's an academic and writer, Anishinaabe descent in Canada. And she has a text that I often bring to my classroom called Land as Pedagogy. And so really thinking about, pedagogy in terms of not just how we, work through knowledge, but also where is our classroom? When the land becomes our classroom, when the land becomes our teacher, and not just in a metaphorical way, but in a living, breathing entity sort of way, how does that shift our consciousness in terms of ecology? One way that I foreground decolonizing science in my classrooms as well is having students think from their own lived experience, their own relationships to the land. In the class that I was just teaching, it was a global class, and we had students from around the world, including 2 students from Palestine. And in answering this question, it really brought to bear on all of us, they were sharing rooftop gardens that in the camps that they're living in, that folks are still creating beekeeping, all of these practices. So really grounding people and students in how our own relationships with the land are forms of knowledge, are forms of scientific knowledge. I think in the context of, the Caribbean, there's so much, when we think about the impact of racist science and plantation geographies really shapes our relationships to the land, our relationships to farming, our relationships to farmers, our relationships to that sort of knowledge. So really regrounding in the, like for just me and the knowledge of my granny as an herbalist, that is a form of scientific knowledge. So really just reimagining and re-envisioning what constitutes scientific knowledge, and starting from our own lived experience, and then working with the land directly as a literal living being and partner in our understanding.
Thank you so much. I wanted to even position the question, one of the things we haven't even begun to talk about in the context of this education. You mentioned it slightly, Moji, just in terms of the kind of language still being used in some of our textbooks, but even the context of our own religion, indigenous religions, spiritual practices, there is so much to decolonize, and I think it has affected every single thing that we know about ourselves as African people, as people of African descent. And I'm raising it because it explains why we are afraid of ourselves at a certain time in our lives. It's because the grounding that we've received, whether at the primary or the secondary level, I use myself as an example. It was when I got to university and was able to engage in independent thinking and independent, selection of courses and so on, that I then had an understanding of what was indigenous religious practice in the region. It shouldn't be that we get to tertiary level before we can explore those aspects of ourselves, because they're fundamental to our, we can use big words like ontology and epistemology and so on, but it's really down to the ways of being, ways of knowing. I see quite a bit of fear in our people when I look in their eyes, and it goes right back to the education system, that we have alienated ourselves from ourselves through this colonial education. We have so much work to do. Dr. Moji Anderson has said, thank you, Cynthia. She has found the text. Any other questions or comments?
Dr. Sonia, just to follow up on that, I'm really curious about how this kind of emerging question of the legalization of obeah might bear on some of what we're talking about in terms of education. There's so much in terms of the stigma that comes from, oftentimes education, but also Christianity. But we're also talking about, sacred knowledge systems that have their own, more internal educational processes that aren't necessarily meant to be shared widely in an educational context in the ways that we might imagine. So I don't have any, answer or response, but it's definitely something I think that would be interesting to explore, how that question of legality of obeah might shape education.
So you will be happy to know, Cynthia, that we have had an entire webinar such as this one on spiritual reclamation. And it focused heavily. Some of the speakers, some of whom are online actually now today, were very much speaking about the decriminalization of some of our spiritual practices, such as Obia. And the ways in which, when you look across the region, there is evidence. It's not just Obia, it's, you know, whether it was spiritual Baptist, there are quite a number of legislative instruments used to suppress various aspects of life, the spiritual in particular. You know, ban on drums, a calendar. There is an entire, let me say, system in place through legislative instruments that tell us about the suppression of not just entertainment, but spiritual practices. And it comes up in my own work on Jamaican dancehall. It has led me to examine in a broader African diaspora context what has taken place in terms of the suppression of Black life. So there's a question from Jacqueline. If we look at where we want to be as a society, I guess we can use that to shape or decolonize education. That is exactly what we're saying. And I want us to focus on that Caribbean citizen. In 2025, in 2035, we're now in 2025, 10 years from now, what are we going to see in terms of these societies of the region? I also want to acknowledge Alison Fung's placement in the chat, showing us the work at the CARICOM level in relation to educational reform. She says, I'm hoping that this might actually result in some changes. The Educational Transformation Commission of CARICOM. We know also that many countries in the region have engaged in some degree of educational transformation work. Jamaica, I can speak of the Ministry of Education launching the Educational Transformation Commission work in, I think we got that report in 2023. I don't know what has come of this report, but I know that the work is ongoing, and I'm hoping in a very big way for some real change. I also want to acknowledge Professor Sylvia Cohenberg's comment. There has been several hundred years of internalization of the message that European languages are superior. And this, of course, explains why is it even among our policymakers, there is reluctance to engage in a meaningful conversation or our language policy in relation to our own Creole languages. So how can we begin to overcome this resistance? There is so much work to be done there. Also want to acknowledge Alice Corbel, who has been very active in our chat, posting some links for us and responding to comments as well. We also have the compelling research being highlighted by Sylvia Cohenberg about our own language issues there. So if you haven't been looking in the chat, there's quite a wealth of information there for you. Any other comments or questions? Perhaps what I will do now then is to ask each speaker to give us a few closing remarks on the basis of the presentation so far and comments. And we'll just go in the order that we started as well. So we'll start with Dr. Anderson.
Oh boy. Okay, well, I made a comment earlier, I guess. But I suppose I would say that the work to create the Caribbean human that we want to see, you say citizen, I understand why you say that. I'm not a fan of nation states, so I'm just going to avoid that word. The Caribbean human is someone who is almost unrecognizable from the standpoint of 2025. Someone who does not take conventional wisdom for granted, who is always asking the question, why? Always asking the question, why? Asking the questions, why? Who said so? Why could they potentially have said so? And what are the effects of asking these questions and not asking those other questions? The ability to think outside of what is presented to you. And that is something that I, as a university teacher, note that my students, generally speaking, cannot do. And that's why I did the research I did. That's why I went to the secondary level. And of course, as I said, I want to go to the primary level. That's even more fundamental, I think, even more foundational to the way that people think as young adults. So I think it's getting them into this mode of thinking outside of what is presented to them and always understanding motivations behind presentations of particular kinds of knowledge. Ideally, I'd also like them to be speaking, if for the Jamaican students to be speaking patois to me. I don't speak it well. That's my particular family history, travel history. But I understand it perfectly fine. And I encourage my students actually to do presentations in patois, but very, very few take me up on it because it seems as if some major transgression. I want them to not be frightened when I say that we're going to go to a revival church in St. Thomas for our field trip. I want them to accept it as an exciting opportunity and not one that they have to be fearful of. I want them to constantly be questioning me about where I'm getting my information from. These are, I'm just throwing out some ideas. There's a lot more to it, but I think that if we could perhaps try to decenter whiteness at every stage, whether it's aesthetics, I don't want to see so much fake hair in my classrooms. There's different angles you could take with this idea of extracting yourself from white supremacy. So those are just a few ideas off the top of my head.
Thank you, Moji. David? Sorry, Cynthia.
No mind either way. Thank you, all of you. I feel really encouraged coming out of this conversation, and I just wanted to respond to some of what I've learned and I'm thinking about from each of you. Dr. Anderson, you're speaking about counter-curriculum, really vital, and I'm thinking about how that moves alongside the many ways that maroonage might allow us to think about these counter spaces for educational practices and pedagogy in all the complexity that holds, I know, in the Jamaican context as well. Dr. Alston, as someone who's done, work in Guyana around archives, I really appreciated what you've shared and thinking about the importance of improving archival access and also preservation in the context of Guyana, and the archives that we have present there will be so critical. And it's great to hear some of the work that you've mentioned that's ongoing in those partnerships. Dr. Dion, your presentation was such an education for me. I was just trying to take rapid notes. Thank you so much for that breakdown, and I'll definitely be revisiting what you've shared with us around just I think someone in the chat said the architecture of Caribbean education, and really kind of grounding us in the practicalities of how this might happen. Dr. Sonia, thinking about 2035, as an ecologist, my mind goes to, some of the projections about what islands or parts of islands might be underwater. I know parts of Georgetown are projected to be underwater as we're already at or below sea level in certain points. I think we're reaching a point where, decolonization, sometimes I laugh when people talk about the impracticality or the practicality of it, because it will be an imperative. We're not going to survive. The earth will survive, but we will not survive as beings, whatever we call ourselves, without reconstituting the nature of our relations with the earth through our earth-based practices and the knowledges therein. So I think we're reaching a point where evolution is required. It's imperative that we will have to shift so much about how we interact with each other and interact with the earth. And I think that there are really critical conversations that need to be had about spaces where we might not be able to be anymore, and how that's going to shift not just education, but whole islands that we might not be able to live in anymore. How's that going to shape so much of our future, education being one part of that. But anyway, I know I went to a different space maybe, but I think there's so much that we stand to have to meet in becoming and embracing a different way of being so that we do survive as whatever we might call ourselves, humans or post-humans. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. David?
Thank you. I feel I'm very much a listener in these discussions, and two of the things that have stuck with me, that phrase "creative intellect" and its importance, and I think when we look at the history of those millions of people who were taken from Africa to the Caribbean and survived slavery, I think the creativity that involved is important to remember. I think it often gets lost in the histories that are written, which very understandably and rightly emphasize the dreadful nature of life on a slave plantation. But it seems to be involved a creativity in forming new identities, new kinds of community that would work in a way that would allow people to survive slavery. So I think it's part. So I think that creative intellect is very, very much part of the history. And it's given the challenges of climate change and what is going to happen, that kind of creativity is something that everyone needs, that the world needs. Cynthia, talked about land, and there's been a lot of talk about language, and land and language resonate with everybody, but many people are migrants. Many people will, climate change means more people will be migrants, and part of that is adapting to life in different places, to new land. So again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
Yes, thank you, David. Dion?
Thank you. I am sorry. I must apologize that I am the person who is ringing the alarm today. The situation that we're in now in the region with education, it is rapidly deteriorating at the primary and the secondary level. And I think the exam results tell us that. And as an educator, it is such a concern and a disturbing fact for me that our Caribbean countries have not yet recognized where we are. And the data is there. It tells us what things look like. Mostly, I must say that the idea of a post-colonial project in education or decolonization in education has not yet started, notwithstanding the years of reform. What we've really and merely done is to rehabilitate the colonial character and entrench it even further in our system and accept it as normal. And so it is a challenge, I think, but I think if we have people who are willing to pull that apart and begin to look at where do we start? We start with who do we want the Caribbean citizen to be? Well, how do we want them to speak? How do we want them to work? What skills do we want them to have? And these presentations here have drawn that out for me. So the issues with language, a lot of that has to do with how we teach language in the classroom. So language skills that students need to be able to communicate later when they're workers, it's largely missing because they're not engaging with the language in the textbooks. Can you imagine what would happen if the money from the trust that is owed to Jamaica was actually put into the education budget in Jamaica to provide the kind of resources that would allow us to really transform? Because the piecemeal thing that we do a little this, we do a little that, actually will not work. So I'm actually ringing the alarm. This is urgent, very urgent. And it's urgent because, as Cynthia said, climate change is upon us. We need to be able to create the scientists, the young people who can think through how we stem the tide of hurricanes ravaging the south coast of Jamaica or St. Lucia or ravaging the Bahamas. We actually need to be able to create the scientists. And if we don't transform the heart of the system, we are, as she said, I am not sure we will survive. I'm just sorry I had to ring that alarm. Thank you very much.
Alarm bell needed ringing. Dion, thank you for ringing that alarm. I want to address before we go a prevailing set of comments in the chat that UWI and the University of Guyana are leading us, should be the ones leading us out of this education wilderness. I really, as I said in my earlier comment, that the crisis is far deeper than we imagine. Many researchers have been writing, have been contributing to policy work, have been telling the governments exactly what they need to be hearing. But the translation from research into policy and into action or implementation is what we are lacking. So let me just address that. Do not for one moment believe that our researchers at these universities in the region have not been sounding the alarms that you are hearing, some of which you are hearing in this webinar. The other thing I want to suggest is that as we consider the Caribbean citizen in 2035, we are here only in one conversation. This conversation needs to be happening in our homes, in our streets, in our villages, in our communities. We are, in the context of this reparatory justice movement, trying to touch every single aspect of the Caribbean being. In that regard, the webinars that we have staged are online at the Center for Reparation Research's YouTube channel. You can see those webinars. We have done conversations on spiritual reclamation, on cultural reparation. We have today looked at education. We have looked at climate change. And we are very much committed to continuing this conversation because it is partially the route to greater education. Look at the links that have been shared in the context of this webinar. It is about each one teaching one. And I want to thank you all for coming online with us, for sharing with us. Let us leave each other with the question, where is our classroom? Where is our classroom? That classroom is decentered in a decolonial Caribbean. It is under the tree. It is online. It is certainly not confined to the four walls of any institution that we imagine today. So thank you so much all for coming. Stay tuned. Follow us on social media. We are at Reparation, the Center, CRR_UWI on Instagram and on X. And you can stay tuned to our YouTube channel as well. See you next time. Thank you all so much for coming and for being with us today. Thank you to our panelists. Stay tuned for the next in our webinar series.